Wonderful. I am so excited today. I want to welcome you to the Disability Research and Education in Academic Medicine, or DREAM, research rounds. My name is Lisa Meeks, and I'm the Executive Director of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative and an Associate Professor of Learning Health Sciences at the University of Michigan Medical School. As you may know, the DREAM Consortium is part of the Docs with Disabilities Initiative, and we are focused on 4 areas. First, we aim to create mentorship and grow a robust community of scholars to advance disability inclusion research in academic medicine. Second, we want to highlight and promote the research that's already been done on disability inclusion in academic medicine. Third, we want to identify and address gaps in disability data in academic medicine. And finally, our hope is to connect researchers and stakeholders to promote cross-cultural collaborations. Our speaker today has already been a cross-cultural collaborator. He is an amazing cheerleader for all things disability inclusion, and it is my absolute pleasure to introduce you to him today. Satendra Singh is a professor of physiology at the University College of Medical Sciences at GTB Hospital in Delhi. He is a Bucksbaum International Scholar and visiting scholar at the McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics at the University of Chicago. And that is where I had the pleasure of first meeting Dr. Singh. He's also a fierce disability justice advocate who has brought many policy reforms, including the inclusion of disability competencies in the new competency-based medical curriculum in India. He is a champion for the cause of viewing disability from a human rights perspective rather than a deficit-based perspective. He is also the founder of Docs with Disabilities, Agents of Change, an organization for health professionals with disabilities in India. I think most importantly, Dr. Singh is a warm, gracious, incredible colleague and beautiful human. And I'm so glad that he is with us today. And I will turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meeks, for that wonderful introduction. Good evening, everyone. This is 7:30 p.m. in India, and good morning to all of you in the United States, and good afternoon to people in Australia. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, Dr. Meeks. Today, I'll be talking about our research, which was on using health humanities to teach disability competencies to first-year undergraduate medical students. But before I begin, let us take a moment to pause and honor the legacy of Judith Heumann, who said, "I want to see fiercely disabled people change the world." And nobody can forget that landmark Capitol crawl moment, which was coming out of age of an international disability rights movement. We mourn the passing of Judith Heumann on 4th of March. But she inspired an entire generation of disability rights activists, not only in the United States, but around the globe. In today's grand round, the work which we have been highlighting was published in the journal Disability and Health Journal. The research team included faculty members from the Department of Physiology, Ophthalmology, Community Medicine, and Pathology. But they were also wearing a different type of hats. We all were the part of health humanities group at our medical institution, medical school. And one among us is a person with a lived experience of disability and a disability rights activist. Another one is a theater of the oppressed proponent, what we call as Joker in the language of Augusto Boal. The third one is a photographer and a community leader. And the fourth one is a storyteller, poet, and a writer. Let me take you to the background of this research work. So after 22 years in India, the regulatory body, National Medical Commission, they launched a new competency-based curriculum in the nearly 650 medical schools in India in 2019. However, still, when we visualize the competencies, they were still heavily based on the deficit-based model or medical model of disability. So during that time, based on a grant from University of Chicago Center in Delhi, we framed a disability inclusive compassionate care project in which we framed 27 disability competencies for Indian medical graduate. And this work was basically based on focus group discussions with doctors with disabilities in India, and disability rights activists, and health professional educators in India. And based on a successful judicial advocacy, 8 of these disability competency were included as a mandatory component in the foundation course in all 650 medical schools in India. Now, there is a parallel between these competencies, which comes under the National Medical Commission, because if you look at the 5 roles of an Indian medical graduate, they are in sync with the 6 ACGME competencies, as well as 7 CANMATS role. For example, the competencies medical knowledge and patient care in the ACGME are equivalent to the role of clinician in Indian medical graduate, as well as the role of medical expert in CANMATS. So there's a lot of parallels between them. And these disability competencies include describe disability as per the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, while demonstrating respect for the differences and capacities of persons with disabilities. It included comparison and contrasting between the medical and the social model of disability. It already had psychomotor components like demonstrate a non-discriminatory behavior towards patients as well as caregivers with disabilities. Demonstrate the use of verbal and non-verbal empathetic communication techniques while communicating with people with disabilities. It talked about disability etiquettes, advocating social inclusion by raising awareness of the human rights of people with disabilities, having an understanding of accessible healthcare, whereby we mean universal design, and to demonstrate the awareness of the disabilities which were included in the Indian disability legislation. The rationale for this is also something, today is also a special day because today is the 100th day of the launch of the World Health Organization's most recent global report on health equity for persons with disability. And it states that 1.3 billion people, or 1 in 6 among us, experience some form of disability. It also includes that 1 in 3 elderly people experience disability, which makes people with disability as the world's largest minority. And the global report says that we need to develop competencies for disability inclusion in the education of all health and care workers. There is also few publications which highlight the rationale, because if you look at the perceptions of practicing physicians towards patients with disabilities, the landmark publication by Lisa Izzoni in Health Affairs in 2021 states that around 82% of the practicing physicians in the United States believe that disabled patients have worse quality of life. Only 41% were confident to provide same quality of care to patients with disabilities in comparison to those without disabilities. And just 56% strongly agreed to welcome patients with disabilities into their practices. 2 years ago, in 2019, another paper by Agaronic, again in Health Affairs, also highlighted that there was a poor understanding towards legal responsibilities. Specifically, the paper highlighted about the lack of understanding of how to provide reasonable accommodations to patients with disabilities as well as students with disabilities. Now, all of this highlights towards what? It highlights towards attitudes and behaviors, which at times are the most difficult to change. And that too for adults who have their fixed mindset. And that's why there is probably we need to look for another tools, different type of tools, which can change the perceptions. Based on our work in the field of health humanities, earlier we suggested tools to develop humanistic competencies. We proposed a model which was the ABCD paradigm, which was to introduce tools from the health humanities in medical students to inculcate analytical attitude, ethical and professional behavior, how to make effective communication, respect for diversity, and be empathetic. We proposed humanistic competencies in the form of narrative competence, critical reflexivity, visual literacy, advocacy, and structural humility, and suggested tools to achieve these competencies. So since this was our forte, so we thought that now the disability competencies are a part of the new medical curriculum. We piloted these competencies on the new cohort of the first year medical undergraduate students who came as the first batch in 2019 CBME. And we used different tools from the field of health humanities. The first one was storytelling. We invited people with lived experiences of disabilities, not only those with physical, visible disabilities, but also those with invisible disabilities, to share their stories about how they face discrimination. Literature states that a lot of time we use patients as educators, but here we invited people with disabilities in the classroom lecture theater, and we call them as medicine's most important teachers, because now in the lecture theater, they were not patients, they were experts, because they had the lived experience of disability, and they are teaching the future medical professionals about disability. In these sessions, we invited a visual artist who heard those stories of oppression, discrimination happening in healthcare and otherwise. And she made visual arts based on what she heard from those storytelling sessions. And we used those paintings in the next session to interact with medical students about what they learned. We also used poetry to talk about disability awareness. And these poems were not only in English, but they were also in Hindi, in our Indian local vernacular languages. We talked about patient narratives, both verbal as well as non-verbal. For verbal, we used narratives, and for non-verbal, we used what we call as image theater in the theater of the oppressed lingo. Then we projected a forum theater, which we call as rehearsal for life, to change the attitudes of medical students. And finally, we take them to a field visit to see what an accessible healthcare setting means, because that school was an inclusive school with accessible features. On the screen, there is a table which shows the blueprint of the disability competencies modules. And we use not only large group interactive teaching, but we also used small group teaching to its full effect. One of the examples is that of a poem. And on the screen, there is a photograph of a surgeon with visible physical impairment. And I'll just read out a very short excerpt, which was written by Pooja Premwar, the poet, and this artwork is made by our medical student, Shubham Arora. Long before seeing people, I viewed bodies as structures. To me, it made sense, symmetry and balance. Only poets talk essence. Yet, trapped in a structure that did not conform, my leg and my body defied the norm. Who needed fixing, me or my surroundings? I sometimes sit during long surgeries. It's less often from fatigue and more out of incredulity at being able to see the people, not merely in their bodies, like I learned to see mine, and I bow and awe to the mystique and the fascinating diversity. We gathered the learners' feedback immediately after the piloting of these disability competencies module, which spanned over 2 days, 2 different days. And the details are given in the paper also, but largely medical students, they related with the different tools of humanities, which portrayed the struggles and the life struggles of people with disabilities. The early learner feedback was on visual arts. In visual arts, we also used, in addition to the visual harvesting, the portraits made by disabled artists like Riva Lehrer from Chicago and Frida Kahlo, as well as the painting Ugly Duchess, which highlighted the Paget's disease. Our learners responded that they were able to visualize struggle in these visual arts, and they were able to identify the patient perspective, which is hitherto not visible when they are in clinics. They were motivated, and it inspired them to change. They were able to see the acceptance and the discrimination happening in those visual arts. Regarding poetry, they agreed that through poetry, we can express emotions, feelings, and pains based on interaction with a person with disability. Poetry can help medical students to connect and influence at an emotional level. And definitely one of the findings which we want that every medical student should have is that poetry is definitely a tool to induce empathy. Based on the patient narratives as well as the image theater, our learners agreed that there is a merit in person's first approach and we need to respect the dignity of people with disabilities. They were able to identify the societal barriers which were prevailing in the society and which were creating barriers for patients with disabilities. They were able to understand the nuances and they were able to empathize with people with disabilities. But there was just immediate feedback. The real feedback is one which happens afterwards. So after 4 months, we again asked for them to write reflections based on whatever they learned in the foundation course or their interaction with the person with disability. And after 4 months, the reflections, when we analyzed them through deductive analysis, we found that they were falling into these different themes: respect for diversity, dignity, autonomy, non-discrimination, social inclusion, equity, accessibility, universal design, human rights, disability rights, as well as advocacy. I read out some of the exemplary quotes. I realize the importance of sign language. Don't think you have the power, the audacity to give us names. We will decide what we want to be called. This statement made by a panelist makes me wonder what kind of impertinent, frustrated, tired doctors they have met. Disability should not define one's capability. Treat everyone by giving them the utmost respect they deserve. We should not categorize people based on appearance. It is important to inculcate a threshold between sympathy and empathy and not treat the patient as just a medical case, rather a human being. Wheelchairs are a source of empowerment, not demotivation. And one of the students was involved in advocacy, and he stated that I wrote a letter to the municipal corporation to make the roads and pedestrians equipped for the visually impaired and urged them to install accessible pedestrian signals to help the visually impaired. What were the lessons learned from this mixed method qualitative study? Around 90% of our respondents or medical students, they agreed that every patient has a story of disability to tell. So we believe that the tools from the field of health humanities were able to highlight those things which are usually invisible in a doctor-patient relationship in a clinical OPD setup. They were able to identify the struggles which are exhibited by patients with disabilities. And more so, who told these stories? These stories were told to them by people with a lived experience of having a disability, be it visible disability or an invisible disability. On the side of the slide there is a screen where the visual artist is showing the visual harvested images which she made after hearing those storytelling sessions. And perhaps that prompted the student to write that wheelchair is a sign of empowerment and not demotivation. And our students agreed that on the spot, this visual harvesting tool was the on the spot capturing of patients with disabilities' real experiences. We also used forum theater from the field of theater of the oppressed. And the respondent feedback was that it helped medical students to move beyond a reflection into the realm of action. Because these forum theaters are not 5 to 6 minutes of scripted stories. Rather, these are not at all role plays. Rather, what happens in these forum theater is that we invite medical students to identify who is the person who is struggling in that scene, to identify the oppressed person. And they're asked to replace that oppressed person. The oppressor, the person in a state of power, remains as such within the scene, and thereby initiates a dialogues between the oppressor and the oppressed person. The number of interventions which were made during the 2 forum theaters which we highlighted in our module helped us in understanding that, medical students were quite keen and they were quite disturbed to see the ethical dilemma which were portrayed in the scene. For example, the scene which has been highlighted on the screen is the one where there is a medical student who has applied for a post-graduation, and he has been denied the seat as a postgraduate trainee based on his locomotor disability. And in the scene, he is there confronting the people in the medical board. And the number of interventions by students showed us that they want to change the script, they want to change the narrative. by using the crutches which are there. They are not feigning disability. Rather, they are trying to be in the shoes of the person who is facing this oppression. This is a powerful tool to inculcate empathy. Another thing which we learned, and even in this scene also, it highlights the capability imperative, which is persistent in health professions education throughout the globe. Another thing which was there, which we noticed, was that even after this module, there was a short fraction of medical students who retained some negative connotations, for example, which were based on the euphemistic language, like the use of specially abled, as well as the implicit biases, as well as the inspiration porn, where they highlight only the achievements of disabled persons and not their lived experiences. And this makes me wonder that whether only just 7 hours of exposure of disability competencies is appropriate. We realized from this research that perhaps what we need is a longitudinal introduction of disability competencies throughout, because the medical model of disability is deeply rooted in our curriculum, and it needs, constant threatening of this model. That's why we need multiple interventions throughout the 5 years of medical schooling in the medical school to change these negative connotations. We also realized that our students were able to understand that when we're talking about disability, it is not only about deficit, rather what we are talking about is that disability is a development as well as a human rights issue. What are the future directions based on this? So in 2019 in India, the National Medical Commission was able to incorporate disability competencies as a mandatory component in our competency-based curriculum in all the 600 medical schools. On the contrary, still in many countries, this is still an optional module and not a mandatory module. We believe this is too important a subject to be used as an elective, and everybody must know about these disability competencies. In 2021, the National Council for Disability, an autonomous body in the United States, they have written 2 letters to the Joint Commission as well as the ACGME regarding making the disability cultural competencies mandatory in the curriculum in the United States. And we need to collaborate and advocate for disability rights to make it mandatory in various countries. And this morning when I woke up to a very interesting tweet, very heartening tweet, and whereby I came to know that Dr. Lisa Meeks has been appointed as an advisor in the ACGMA competencies. And that's what we need. We need collaboration to advocate for disability inclusion in medical education. I began earlier by talking about attitude and behavior, and we need to change this attitude and behavior, and we need multimodal agencies. We need the help of each and every person, not only people with disabilities, but also allies, also policymakers who are there. Based on our research, what we propose is also that, it is the longitudinal inclusion of disability competencies in healthcare, which will help medical student or health professional students, because just having a 2-hour or a 3-hour diversity and inclusion workshop at the beginning will not change attitudes and behaviors. We need to constantly talk about disability issues as human rights issues so that students learn about these issues throughout in their curriculum. Also, the tools from the health humanities, as we saw in our research, are able to challenge the stereotypes or the implicit biases present in many of the undergraduate medical students. And also they agreed that different tools, not everybody can write poetry, not everybody can have an interest in visual arts, but when we are giving them multiple spoonful of humanities in different forms like narratives, poetry, graphic medicine, storytelling, theater of the oppressed, of course, that will encourage creativity based on their own interest. And that's why what we need is the health humanities portrait, which has been developed in the UIC in Chicago. We need to have those modules to implement these disability competencies. And that would be a right way to make effective communication. We talked about how to change attitudes, behaviors, how to make effective communications. The next thing is very important, which is how to inculcate empathy. And it is very important for educators who are framing these modules for disability competencies. It is important to learn what we learned from our research is that conversations by, for, and with the people with disabilities must be part of these interventions. These modules must be led by people with disabilities in any capacity, be it in the form of educators or the students, or by giving inputs in the delivery of the curriculum or in the design of the curriculum. They should be part of these conversations in line with nothing about us without us. That will inculcate empathy. Finally, we talked about ABCD paradigm. The D stands for respect for diversity. It is very important to understand that when we're talking about the issues of marginalized community, we need to show cross-movement solidarity. When we are talking about disability community, there are a lot of parallels and there are a lot of sharing of mistrust in the medical establishment between not only disabled people, but also transgender people as well as intersex community. There is a gross violation of their autonomy as well as their right to bodily integrity as well in those communities. And that is why it makes a lot of sense for us, for people with disabilities, as well as those who are belonging to other vulnerable groups, to show cross-movement solidarity. With that, I end my presentations, and I would like to acknowledge my co-authors, Dr. Preet Thaliwal, Navjeevan Singh, Amir Khan Mahroof, and my other co-authors, as well as panelists. And thank you so much, Dr. Meeks and the team DREAM, for giving me this opportunity. I'm open to feedback and questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.